Pleased to be joined now on the Newsline by Richard Stern. Mr. Stern is Vice President of the Plymouth Institute for Free Enterprise at Advancing American Freedom. You find them online at advancingamericanfreedom.com. Mr. Stern, good morning, and thank you for the time.
Good morning, and thank you for having me on.
From the It's a Small World department, I see in your bio, and you mentioned it just before we came on the air, you were a former staff member for Congressman Steve King, who joined us in the last hour.
Absolutely. He's one of the best guys. I had a pleasure working for him in Congress and serving, Northwest Iowa. I actually handled agriculture policy for him for a little bit over 2 years. So always good to be talking to an Iowa audience.
Good to have you here. Remind folks who have might not have heard prior conversations we've had with folks from Advancing American Freedom. Who are you folks, and what do you do?
Well, thank you for asking. So, we're a think tank in Washington, D.C., and of course what that means is that we write a lot about what's going on in the news, public policy. We advise members of Congress, people in the administration, but we also do original research to saying, why are prices high? Why are interest rates high? And really, and maybe most importantly, what can be done to alleviate those kind of pressures for the American public? Now, we are conservative, and for us, part of what that means is we believe in free markets, limited government, ultimately the dignity and sanctity of all human life and your personal liberties. We're for rugged individualism and for making sure you always have access to it.
Well, this is a what have you done for me lately society, I'm afraid, and it was just Independence Day last year that the president signed the reconciliation bill into law, the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. But it's very complicated in a number of respects, and apparently people don't like to take the time to talk about complicated things these days. And you folks at Advancing American Freedom are trying to get the word out. Don't forget what happened with the Big Beautiful Bill when you go to cast a vote this coming November.
Absolutely. So, it's easy as we're talking about here to look at what's going wrong in the world, to look at where unaffordability is an issue, and to say, I think those guys in D.C., they never do anything for me. And trust me, as a former congressional staffer, that's often the case. But it's not the case about the One Big Beautiful Bill. I think this was a signature legislative achievement. There are all of these great provisions in there that are bringing more oil into the market, that drop costs for American families. Heck, for the first time in U.S. history, there's a gigantic tax cut in there just for building factories right here in America. So for this and a million other reasons, we wanted to put together a giant compendium just to make it digestible, just to translate into normal plain English all of the amazing benefits of the bill and how it's working every day to make Americans' lives better.
Why do you think this has not been fully and properly understood by enough members of the American voting public?
Well, if you think about it this way, the product we just put out, the One Big Beautiful booklet we put out to explain the One Big Beautiful Bill, it's 90 pages long, and it's not just a book that's 90 Word doc pages. It's really 66 individual 1- and 2-page memos. So again, nothing in here is too complicated, too deep. It's all pretty, crisp, clear-cut. But even then, it took 66 of these. It took 90-plus pages. There's a lot in here. It's still very complicated. So, most people, they've got day jobs. They've got families to take care of. Their job isn't to sit down and go through hundreds and hundreds of pages of legislative text and know all the things that are in there. And, a lot of people in D.C. stick with the top lines. They write one page. Here's the top 3 talking points on it. And so we realized there was a real need to sit down and do something that was closer to 100 pages that really went through all of these little benefits here and there that are easy to ignore or miss if it's not what you live day in and day out.
On the Iowa Business Report this weekend, we'll speak with Tracy Burns. You folks might remember her from the Fox Business Network. She has a new book out, and in it chronicles many of these things, these great breaks for individuals and businesses that have been missed out. People have just not paid attention to. And so there's a lot of activity on this front to some degree of people saying, wow, I didn't know that was in there too. Because for many of us, I think, Mr. Stern, we heard, well, this is a way to make permanent the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which was tremendous to make that permanent. But it went so much further. What are some of the things that if you strike up a conversation with someone about the One Big Beautiful Bill, what are some things that they often say, really? I had no idea that was there.
Well, I do want to start by one thing you said there. It made permanent the tax cuts from 2017, the first time Trump was president. Mm-hmm. That was avoiding a $4 trillion tax hike. Yes. The way that I explain that to people is you got a train headed for a broken track, and we threw the lever at the last second, got it onto good track. But, the passengers don't get a paycheck that says, here's how much would have been taken off the top if we hadn't extended those. So that in of itself, I think, is a massive thing.
And I'm going to interrupt you only because you are absolutely right about that, because and this was a trap to some degree, and that's why I don't like these sunset provisions in laws, because that was a heavy, heavy lift to get that across the finish line. It had huge benefit, but nobody sees it per se, right? We would have seen it had there been this massive tax increase. So, again, you don't get credit, I suppose, if you're the majority for doing the things that people don't necessarily notice, but you're quite right to point out that was a huge, huge thing.
Absolutely. And, another thing about this that people don't think about often is uncertainty itself is a tax. And we made permanent all of these things that were good for small businesses, for factories, for companies of all shapes and sizes. But, with those uncertain beforehand and expiring, there's only so much you can plan, you can invest. There's only so many jobs you can create by making those permanent. But, to answer your question as well, what's new in here, this brand new tax cut for building factories. Before this, it used to be if you spent money building a factory, you had to take the deduction for your construction costs over a 39-year period. The IRS treated it like you still let about 97.5% of the money you spent on the factory in hand, and they could tax it. And now you get to take the deduction all up front. It means it's way more lucrative to actually build factories here. But, beyond that, on the individual side of it, there's now an above-the-line charitable giving deduction. So it used to be that, really the only way you could get a tax cut for charitable giving was if you were a, very wealthy multimillionaire, billionaire. Now, anybody can take a tax cut by giving charitable giving. It completely reroutes, who's giving and where foundations get their money from. It's not just the wealthy doing it. There's now, of course, obviously no tax on tips and overtime pay, things like that. And if you go down the list, you'll find many, many more of these things. Permanence for small business only deductions. There's a million of these little cuts that are good for individuals, for families. We extended and expanded the child tax credit, for example. And again, things that are squarely good for businesses and indulge them and induce them to bring money back here and create more jobs and raise wages. The list goes on and on and on.
We're speaking with Richard Stern. Mr. Stern is Vice President with the Plymouth Institute for Free Enterprise at Advancing American Freedom. They are online at advancingamericanfreedom.com. Mr. Stern and his policy staff at the Institute responsible for this 90-page report. Don't let the number scare you. There's a lot of good stuff in there, as mentioned, some 60 key reforms in the One Big Beautiful Bill. You can find it at Advancing American Freedom's website, advancingamericanfreedom.com. Mr. Stern joins us live on News Talk 1540 KXEL. And one of the things that, and we're looking ahead at April 15th, the federal income tax filing deadline, people just hate the date. They hate the whole process of taxes. As a lawyer, I used to prepare taxes for people. I didn't like doing it. People don't like it. But one of the things that the 2017 Act did was simplify a lot of things for people with that much higher standard deduction. That not only was a benefit straight up in terms of dollars, but you didn't have to go through all the rigmarole of taking your shoebox of receipts into the tax preparer.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that was one of the major things that everyone wanted to do there. Look, it's not the most fun thing, but a business, of course, has sometimes accountants on staff. They do this, and it's part of their business is to keep track of where the money is going. Look, for most people, you've got your real life. You've got your day job. You've got your family to take care of. Why should we make every American have to double as a CPA? That's what the old tax system did. And Well, TCJA meant you didn't have to do that. Again, if it had expired, you'd be right back to shoeboxes of receipts and collecting this and collecting that. That's one of the other hardships that was avoided because OB3, the One Big Beautiful Bill, made the simplification of the tax code permanent. But, it also made the simplification permanent for small businesses who pay through the individual income tax system. And again, that's one of those many benefits. It used to be, this is an old statistic, but it used to be that Americans spent about 2/3 as much on tax preparation and accounting as we did as a nation just on national defense. And you don't think about it, but that adds up, and it saps our strength of endeavors we could be placing towards making life better for all Americans.
That's such an interesting point because, again, business generally has various roadblocks that often are in place because of regulation, government regulation. That's been reduced when Republicans are in office, but it's still there. Small business, that's even worse in terms of you don't have the time because maybe your small business is in addition to a full-time W-2 job. Even if it's not, you're living, breathing, sleeping that small business. It's late at night when you finally have time to do the paperwork. You just don't need more burdens and more hassles. And being able to, you mentioned factories, being able to not have to wait 4 decades to expense that out. As a smaller business, if you can expense out whatever piece of equipment it is in a given year, the year of purchase, that's a huge benefit it's a realistic way to show it on the balance sheet, especially then when it comes tax time.
And one of the things we've got to remember as well is that these kind of paperwork burdens, regulatory burdens, these things are infinitely disproportionately punitive on small businesses versus large ones. And for people who are concerned about monopolies and concerned about concentration within markets, for people who, say, where did all the small businesses go? Or why are these industries dominated by large multinationals? Look no further than the regulatory regime. It's much easier for a large company to have their own in-house lawyers and accountants and tax preparers. For a small business, you've got to go contract with people to do all of that. And so that's one of those subtle ways that these regulatory burdens have quietly over decades gutted and destroyed our American culture of having small local businesses.
You mentioned a moment ago the fact that uncertainty is like a tax. And I find that not only accurate, but also very intriguing. I'd like you to expand on that, if you would, please. Because, again, we have the certainty, and we've been told, okay, now, it's open the floodgates, we're set to go. Talk, if you will, about the reverse, that how uncertainty becomes, in essence, a burden or a tax.
Again, if I need to take 39 years to get the full deduction to build a building, a factory, a refinery, a grain silo, whatever, then I've got to be reasonably confident for 39 years what the future is going to hold, that locality, that industry, whatever. And that's true not just, ambient market conditions, but it's true of regulatory policy, tax policy. One of the big things that was debated in the One Big Beautiful Bill is it rolls back a certain amount of subsidies for wind and solar energy. But it's one of those where if you were a company looking 10 years ago before Biden was president or 20 years ago before Obama was president, and you were looking to say, do we want to invest and build more coal power plants or wind or solar, you're having to guesstimate, is there going to be some new executive action that's going to penalize me? Is there going to be some new tax credit that pays me better to, build a solar farm than build a coal factory or an ethanol plant? And so the more and more the business, both small and large, have to sit down and say, I can't just know what people want. I can't just know what my workers are good at doing, but I have to see through the crystal ball of what the next regulatory whatever is going to be and whether the tax code is going to penalize this or subsidize that. It means that you get paralyzed in what investment decisions you can make. There are all these studies that are coming out using AI to sift through, hundreds of earning calls and looking at data over years. And what we're finding is the more that corporate earning calls mention regulatory uncertainty, you can almost predict easily the lower their value is over time. and the lower that everybody's retirements are over time. And that's exactly what uncertainty does, how it stifles putting your toe in the water and just building a new factory and hiring more people altogether.
What do you hope either the average citizen, the person listening to this conversation on KXEL, what do you hope they do with this information? That's one part of it. The other part of it is, what do you hope these lawmakers on Capitol Hill that you folks are meeting with, what do you hope they do with this information? Because you've put it all right here for us, and there are a number of things here that are going to surprise people, but with those two different audiences, what are you hoping comes of all this?
You know, honestly, I want both audiences in my mind to take the same thing away from this, which is to not lose hope, to not lose faith. I think it's easy, both outside of Congress, but frankly, for being in Congress, it's easy to throw your hands up and say, you know, nothing's ever getting better, no progress is ever made, what's the point in even trying, what's the point in even voting? And I want both populations to take away from this that we've made real progress, that this bill did an enormous amount of good things, that there are people who are working every day and succeeding every day at lessening the burdens on the American public, on getting wins for all of us, and for opening the pathway for us not to rely on government, not to rely on politicians for false giveaway promises, but to rely on freedom, that we can reduce the burdens of government, that we can get government out of the way of our workers or innovators or entrepreneurs, that we can allow each of us to find a way to work for each other, to make each other's lives better. And that's really a lot of what the One Big Beautiful Bill did. And so I want Congress to read this, be proud of what they've done. I want the American public to read through our booklet and be proud of what accomplishments we've made to help free them to get more prosperity. And I want everyone to keep the faith up that we can make more on the down payment of the One Big Beautiful Bill.
It's a good start and has already yielded so many benefits. Richard Stern of the Plymouth Institute for Free Enterprise at Advancing American Freedom. They're online, advancingamericanfreedom.com. Mr. Stern, thank you so much for the excellent conversation and for the work that went into putting this booklet together. Have a great weekend. Hope we talk again.
You as well. Thank you so much for having me on today.
And Mr. Stern joined us live on the Newsline on News Talk 1540 KXEL, where Iowa comes to talk.